Hi, I'm Dave Nelson, Senior Acquisitions Editor for Baker Academic and Brazos Press, and I'm here today with James Eglinton, who is Meldrum's Senior Lecturer in Reformed Theology at the University of Edinburgh. We're here today to discuss James's recent book, Bavinck, A Critical Biography, which is just now being published. I have one of the first copies here in my hand, and the copies for sale will soon go out. And we are very excited about this book, and James, I know you are as well. Many congrats to you. It's a very fine publication, and we're excited to see it in.
Thank you. I'm delighted that it's ready for release now.
James, this is not your first book on Bavinck. You've written several other pieces, a couple of books, and many short pieces on Bavinck. Tell us a little bit about how you got interested in his theology and his biography at first.
Sure. So I discovered his theology when I was a seminary student. I went to seminary here in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and I was a seminarian just around the time when his Reformed Dogmatics, published also by Baker, was being released in English. So he'd been around for a while, obviously, and died in 1921, but in my world, he was this brand new theologian, writing this amazingly crisp, clear, richly historical accounts of Christian theology. And so I discovered him then, and it was just great stuff. And one thing led to another, and I ended up moving from reading quite a lot of Bavinck in my seminary studies to doing a PhD on Bavinck at the University of Edinburgh. My PhD was very much on his theology, though, primarily, rather than his life. So I wrote a thesis on how Bavinck understood the Trinity as something that's revealed in the world, in the cosmos, in general revelation. And I find that Bavinck had this really fascinating way of doing that, in a way that preserved this three-in-one pattern of God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as unique, and yet also somehow revealed in God's creation as a self-revelation of the Trinity. So it was kind of focused primarily on his theology more so than on his life. But the work that I did at that point was implicitly, a work about Bavinck's life as well. In that when I discovered Bavinck and started to read a lot of secondary literature on him, I found that people would talk not about one Bavinck, but about two Bavincks. And he'd been received actually for a few decades as a conflicted figure, as a Jekyll and Hyde figure in Christian theology. As someone who could never decide whether what he really wanted to be was an orthodox conservative Calvinist or a modern person in the modern world.
Sure.
So I found that people would write about him as this conflicted character who would shift between two identities all the time in his work. So my PhD thesis and the book that it led to pushed back quite hard against that and said, no, there's only one Herman Bavinck rather than two. And his way of thinking about God and God is revealed in the world gave him a way of thinking about his own life, where he could be both an orthodox Calvinist, but also a modern person, someone who engaged with modern ideas and lived in the modern world. So that is implicitly a biographical claim.
Sure.
That there's only one Herman Bavinck, and that actually he had a way of thinking that shaped his life, or that grew out of his life context. Right. So that led also then eventually to the biography as well. Needed to write an account of Bavinck's life in light of that kind of an argument that we shouldn't talk about Jekyll and Hyde. We shouldn't talk about two Bavincks. There was just really one figure who had a really rich and interesting life as a theologian in the world.
Very interesting. So, of course, this is not the first biography of Bavinck to have appeared in print. There have actually been several, right?
Yes, yeah. So there have been quite a few. So there were two major Dutch biographies. One came out fairly soon after Bavinck died by a guy called Valentijn Hep. And it's a fascinating biography. It's a gripping read, dramatic in many, many points. But it was compiled in a hurry and based on a lot of sketchy kind of folk tales about Bavinck that are demonstrably very problematic historically, but that have gone on to shape ways that people think about Bavinck, also in the English-speaking world too. It was never translated, but the kind of tales grew arms and legs as they moved into the English-speaking world anyway, by word of mouth.
Sure. Yeah.
So it's a really interesting biography, but if you think about it in terms of accurate history, it's not always reliable.
Yeah.
There was another long, full-length Dutch biography that came out in the 60s by a chap called R.H. Bremer, and it's a very scholarly work. But it's very focused on Bavinck as a public figure. So Bavinck amongst public intellectuals, politicians, theologians, and it's a bit more reticent to move into, let's say, Bavinck the person or Bavinck's home life, for example, in the way that the Hep's biography was very much interested in exploring, but in problematic kind of ways. So there are these two main Dutch biographies. I thought that, having spent quite a lot of years reading Bavinck and thinking about his life and his theology, that I could portray Bavinck quite differently, actually, and could show people things about him that weren't in either of those biographies. There is also one English language biography that came out a few years ago by Ron Gleeson, which is in English, but it's very much an English language amalgam of the two main Dutch biographies, rather than trying to say something quite new beyond them. So my biography is based very much on lots and lots of archival research, and getting into his letters, his diaries, his poetry, following a century of Dutch newspapers to try and get to grips with how his life was kind of mediated to the world and those kinds of ways. So I've tried to provide a new take on Bavinck that's quite different to Hep or Bremer, and by implication then Gleeson as well.
Excellent. And interestingly, having worked through the biography very closely, I mean, that notion that you said earlier about he's not a Jekyll and Hyde figure, but there was a kind of a unity of the person. It really comes across very strongly in the biography itself, and really sets it apart, doesn't it, from the rest of the literature that's been written on Bavinck?
Yeah, I hope so. Anyway, that's what I've tried to do.
Sure. Tell us a little bit about the research that you put in. It's a large book. I'll show you the spine out here. So it is a big critical biography, but it's one that's the result of so much research that you put in. Tell us a little bit about that. Like, how did you go about doing research on his life?
Yeah, sure. So I think, in a way, I was researching it before I realized that that's what I was doing, actually, explicitly for a biography. So after my PhD, which I did in Edinburgh, I then moved to the Netherlands, and I spent 3 years working initially as a postdoc researcher at the Theological University in Kampen in the Netherlands, and that's the city where Bavinck himself spent a couple of decades as a professor, and before that for a year as a student.
Sure.
So I spent 3 years there working on some other theological projects and also working on Bavincks Theology. But when I was there, I had just amazing access to a couple of archives, and 3 archives in particular. One is the Historical Documentation Center for Dutch Protestantism at the Free University of Amsterdam. And they have a Herman Bavinck archive where I would make trips regularly over those 3 years and make PDFs of his diaries, of his manuscripts, and it's a real treasure trove of Bavinck's own unpublished work from across his lifetime. A lifetime of letters, for example, lots of journals, notes from his published works, and also lots of works that he wrote but didn't complete.
Right.
So it's kind of like, if you could walk into Da Vinci's workshop where you have all these incredible half-finished paintings. It's something like that for historical, theological nerd like myself. So I make lots of trips there, just trying to make my own copies of these sources and just build that up as a resource to just try and work on and dig through and look for things. And also in Kampen, there's an archive and documentation center for the Reformed churches, where they also have lots of really fantastic material, and also the city archive in Kampen. So I'd spent years visiting these places in the 3 years that I lived there. And the more research I did, I guess the biography grew quite organically out of this sense, not just of having read his published works and what's out there for all the world to see, but also what was going on in the background, and how did these ideas develop? How does this person form? Because the Reformed dogmatics didn't just drop from the sky. There's something that grew and developed in someone's life circumstances. So I spent lots of time doing that kind of archival research. After I moved back to Edinburgh to take up a lectureship here at the university, with the first sabbatical I had in post here, I went back to Campen for half a year with my family and was again in archives every day, pretty much.
Sure.
When I wasn't at my desk trying to write towards the biography, I was knee deep in handwritten sources and just loving every minute of it. So I spent a lot of time on my own in archives or working with archival sources, but found that it wasn't a lonely experience at all. It was just fantastically enjoyable and enriching, and felt so privileged to be able to take this close look at someone's life and see how it developed, and also then to have the chance to share that with other people in a book.
Absolutely. Were there any things that you discovered along the way that really surprised you that you didn't know about Bavinck before, but then in getting into all of this archival material, suddenly a new insight emerged, something popped up?
Yeah, there were many things that did. I think when I first started reading Bavinck, my impression of him was that he was probably impossibly bookish. You know, to produce the Reformed Dogmatics, which is in 4 volumes, it's just huge and it's so rich and deep. To produce that, you would have to spend your life, doing nothing but reading books and then writing just in massive quantities. And he certainly was bookish, but I think what I had no idea of at all until I came across this reading through his diaries was that the circumstances that gave him the opportunity to do this were really fascinating and quite sad in lots of ways for Bavinck. He was a really human figure, which shouldn't surprise us because he was a living, breathing human being. But part of that was that from his teenage years until the age of 31, he was in love with a woman called Amelia den Decker, but was repeatedly rejected as a suitor by her father. And under Dutch law at that time, if you were under the age of 30, it was really difficult to get married if you didn't have parental permission. And so what you have in Bavinck's diaries from his teenage years until 31 is lots of references to Amelia, or about Amelia, written in Latin to try and keep them coded. But also, lots of references to meetings with her, a reference to him proposing to her the first time that they went to church together, and then the problems that arose when they made their first public appearance together, references to attempts to convince her father to allow them to get married. And you also only had 3 chances to ask.
According to Dutch law, is that only 3 chances to ask?
Wow. So if you ask once and you're 20 years old and you're declined by the prospective father-in-law, you don't just rush back 2 weeks later. It's a really serious thing, and you don't want to waste your chances. So you go away and invest your life in trying to become a more impressive person.
Of course.
And so this really, I think, drives Bavinck into some of his just into the kind of work that he tries to develop in theology in the church. And yet it was repeatedly rejected by this father-in-law. And this actually sets the context for the singleness that he's kind of miserable in it in lots of ways, but he channels it into all of this theological reading, and then also into having this, I guess, the space and the opportunity to produce something as massive and as important as the Reformed Dogmatics. So it's produced by someone who was single and bookish, but who struggled with that in lots of ways as well. And the story of Amelia isn't in any of the previous biographies, for example. It's, until now, pretty much an untold story. But it's, you need to know that to account for, a decade and a half of his life, and also to account for his most intellectually productive years in lots of ways. So I was surprised by that, for example, that Herman Bavinck was sad in love for quite a long time. There were other things that surprised me as well in terms of how I guess I'd spent a lot of my early career on Bavinck pushing back against the idea that there were 2 Herman Bavincks and arguing that there's only one. I've now moved back to saying, well, maybe we can talk about 2 Bavincks, but instead of this Jekyll and Hyde between Orthodox and modern, I think we can talk about a young Bavinck and a mature Bavinck in terms of his theology. And that's really interesting as well in a way that surprised me, because the young Bavinck is someone who expected that the neo-Calvinist movement that he was part of was all set to win the day in a clash of visions of Christianity in the late 19th century. But he didn't at all foresee that Europe or that the West would become post-Christian. It just wasn't in the trajectory that he could see as he tried to look into the future. And then the mature Bavinck, as I think I understand him, in the last couple of decades of his life, really moves away from that and sees all around him that actually people are de-Christianizing in the Netherlands and across the Western world. So there's a shift there in his thinking, in his perception of the world around him. And it doesn't make him give up on his Reformed theology, but it does lead to all kinds of other interesting developments in his thoughts and in his public work, which is that alongside promoting Reformed theology, he starts to make all kinds of public arguments for more kind of general Christianity, because that's being undermined as well as just specific branches of Christianity like his own. But also he starts to invest himself in those decades very heavily in evangelism, in promoting evangelism, in trying to have chairs for missiology set up at the Free University of Amsterdam,
the
Theological School in Kampen, and promoting mission overseas, but also promoting mission amongst white Dutch people, which is not something that people really thought of in those terms in the young Bavinck's years. So that's an aspect, that shift at least is an aspect of Bavinck's life and thought that was really a fascinating surprise to come across. And it's a major, major driving feature in the last couple of decades of his life. So those were two really interesting surprises. There are many more in the book. He was a terrible teenage poet, for example. That he kind of gave up on writing poetry to write about poetry later in his life. So there are lots of fun things like that. But I think the Amelia story is a huge one, actually, for his life. And the shift between a young Bavinck to a mature Bavinck is quite significant too.
Well, and what you're pointing to here, and this is really the value of the kind of work that you've done in this book, it is just to point out, I mean, we don't do our theology, as it were, in sort of isolation from the rest of our lives. We kind of corner ourselves off in a room and then write our theology, and then we're different people outside of the walls. It's part of our biography. It's woven in. So having a resource like this at hand when we're reading Bavinck is really critical, right? Because we see how his theology developed. It unfolded from real life experiences, from the struggles to be a Christian in the world that he was living in, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the kind of the big payoff question that one might ask here, James, would be, we're talking about a theologian who died in 1921, so we're coming up now on the 100th anniversary of his death. He was at the very end of the, as they sometimes call it, the long 19th century. Lived through the Great War to see at least how that war would unfold, but not the aftermath of it. So here we are now, a century later. I guess there's two ways of asking the same question. One way would be to say, what does he have to teach us right today? What is there about Bavinck that really speaks to our situation today? And then, how do we account for, this is kind of the other way of saying it, you're writing this biography not where there's disinterest in Bavinck, but actually quite a bit of interest in Bavinck's thought, his theology, and his biography as well. How do you account for that 100 years later? What do you think that readers are in fact discovering in Bavinck's work that is so valuable and important as we now enter more fully into the century, very strange century that we're in?
Yeah, thanks. No, those are really excellent questions. I think that something that you can observe in the history of theology and the history of how theologians are then received, how some are forgotten about and some others gain quite a wide readership. So something that you can see throughout that history is that I think one of the hallmarks of the works of great theologians is this enduring legacy. It's that people continue to find their work stimulating and useful and interesting.
Sure.
Even if, for example, you yourself as the reader are not in the same theological tradition, or you're not from the same country, or you're not from the same historical period. So non-Thomists read Thomas, non-Barthians read Barth, Calvinists read Calvin. And I think that what we're seeing with Bavinck actually, as his work is disseminated more widely in translation in English, but also in Chinese and in Korean and various other languages, is that people outside of his tradition seem to find a worth in his writings that is just driving this growth of interest in
Mm.
Bavinck across the world 100 years after he died, in a pretty different world as well. So why is that? Yeah, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I think that for Bavinck, maybe I could look at this in two kind of tiers. So, and one is a surface level tier, and the other is something that lurks beneath the surface. On the surface level, what Bavinck does is really attractive to lots of readers as a theologian, because he is really careful and thoughtful and rigorous in how he engages with Scripture.
Mm.
And
Sure.
Christians all across the world and across the ages are concerned with Scripture. So when
Absolutely.
you read Bavinck, you find someone who's reading ultimately the same text as you are,
Sure.
even if you haven't read all the historical stuff in between. But what you find, there's someone who takes these texts so seriously and who exegetes them really carefully. And then what you find is a theologian beyond that who then will guide you through 2,000 years of how those ideas that are derived from those texts are developed in the history of the church,
Mm.
and who has this really amazing knowledge of historical theology as well as the exegetical side of things. And then what you get to at the end with Bavinck in his work, in his writings, is someone who then shows you how he brings that doctrinal development forward into his own day in a way that's really insightful and that's unusually perceptive, I guess.
Mm.
So that's all just a really compelling package,
Sure.
and people find worth in each of those stages, whether it's
Mm.
they really appreciate the exegetical side, or whether he's primarily a valuable historical resource to people, or whether they really are into the kind of moves that he makes with doctrine in its own day. So that on its own, to have someone who does that over, in his dogmatics, 4 volumes of sustained thought, is a really remarkable thing. It was unique in its own day in the Netherlands. If you
Mm.
compare him to other people who were writing dogmatics, he really just blew the competition out of the water. But he's still, I think, up there and recognized increasingly so amongst the ranks of just great theologians who write
Sure.
theology that people love and connect with.
Yeah.
But I think beneath that, beneath the surface, another reason that people are drawn to Bavinck is that if you become a bit more aware of his work, you realize that he didn't just take this way of thinking and writing and only apply it to what we might think of in really conventional terms as theology, the Trinity or salvation
Sure.
or the church or that kind of stuff. But actually, even just when you read the dogmatics, what you see is that there are lines that lead from this immediately actually into every other area of thought.
Sure.
And he's just a hop and a skip away from taking this way of thinking and applying it to how you might think about education or psychology or art or science or politics. And you can just see the readiness to move in that direction from his dogmatics. And then if you start to read him a little bit more widely, you discover, oh, hey, he actually wrote books on all of these things.
Mm.
And then
Sure.
when you start to discover him biographically, you realize, oh, he was a member of parliament for a decade. Okay, he was the
Right.
leading educational psychologist in the Netherlands of his day. Oh, okay, he was one of the leading critics of Dutch colonial policy in his day. And he was leading biographer of poetry, of one of the main Dutch poets of his day. And he actually lived out all of these things in a way that makes his life so fascinating. And I think why lots of people are drawn to that today is that we live in a very, fractured, fragmented phase of modern culture,
Sure.
where it's quite rare to find, a Renaissance man, so to speak,
Right.
somehow moving in all these directions at once. It's really difficult to do.
Yes.
What young people are told a lot nowadays is expect not to have one career, but maybe 4 or 5 across your lifetime.
Sure.
And but that's discontinuity and fragmentation and fracture, and it's
Absolutely.
there because circumstances are not ideal economically at the moment. But to find one person who's actually, whose choice is to try and do all of this at once
Mm.
in a way that's really holistic, that's quite a rare thing, actually. And
It
I think
is.
that's, on some deep down level, that's compelling to our imaginations, because it says there's a different way to live in the modern world that's not all about chaos and fragmentation and a kind of messy postmodern existence. And I think it's very deep down within the dogmatics, even if that's all that you've read, but it's there.
Sure.
And and you don't have to read him much more broadly than the dogmatics before you've stepped into that kind of territory, and he's captured your imagination.
That's such a beautiful way to sort of summarize who he was and his lasting contribution, his legacy. And it really does come across. I mean, James, having worked, through the manuscript at this prior to submission, this was a real page turner for me, perhaps surprisingly so. I mean, I knew of Bavinck and I knew a bit of his biography. I hadn't really read about his life in any meaningful way, but then working through the manuscript, I found it very difficult to put down. It's because of you, because of your ability to convey his life, your ability to write, but it's also because of a very interesting person you're writing about, who really did embody his times. He embodied Christianity in the late 19th and early 20th century, and a commitment to the gospel, and a commitment to, as you put it well, to do all of these different things all at once, an ability to hold all of these different things together in a world that might demand that they be separated apart and fractured. It really does come across in this very fine biography, and we wish, I'll hold it up again, it's a lovely packaging that we put on here with a portrait by Oliver Crisp on the cover. And James, again, we congratulate you on this great Baker academic publication. And we look forward to serving it for a long time. And thank you once again for spending some time with us today.
Well, thank you for the invite. It's been a pleasure to work with Baker over the course of the last couple of years, and to see the book get to the stage. So I'm really excited to have the book out with a publisher that's got such great history with Bavinck as well. But also, like Bavinck, Baker has its own roots in Dutch Reformed Christianity, but is also so focused on the wider culture and Christian world. So very much like Bavinck himself. So it's a real delight for me that the book has come out with yourselves.
We are excited as well. So thank you again, James. Again, the book is Bavinck, A Critical Biography, and it is just now being published. I believe it is available for sale wherever you buy books. Many thanks.